Poole-Wilson is design director at Will+Partners, who describe themselves as future thinkers in workplace, life science and building design. So who better to ask about the long-term impact of COVID on the way we work? Will, as we hopefully start returning to some sort of normality, what are you seeing happening in offices today?
Most businesses we see realize that the individuals have experienced different ways of working, but that question of teamship is very important. And there are big questions about, yes, it's lovely dropping off your children and getting home to read them a story at night, and that's very important in life. But, you know, does that work for all of your team as well? And that balance between what you need to commit to an office relationship and that team really does matter. And you do need the office workspace for that level of collaboration. So time, society, really big questions that we have and we love about talking even about our cities and how we operate are incredibly important. They're questions that have been asked in Taylorism, in the concepts of X and Y, and a lot of it is about basically behavior. So those are the things that we're seeing shift and change in the markets. I call that probably the view of looking at human experience and how that's changing with the shift in technology. The shift in technology, I think, is another question, which has been happening over the last 100 years since we invented the computer, frankly, but has accelerated really since 1998, probably, from the days of DGW, who wrote about it incredibly well and understood how that worked. And that sort of information carrier about how things are happening. So there's a huge shift in time and space, and it is going to be quite interesting just to see what happens. But it does mean we're coming back to the office. I don't think it'll be the same. I don't think anyone thinks it's the same at all, because it really isn't. But you know, we are going to have to work out how we work in a hybrid fashion. In this meeting, we're having a conversation here online, Peter, which is not something I would have imagined doing with you 2 years ago. But actually, you know, how we communicate that out to other people if we had a team here and we were having this conversation really does matter in terms of getting the right answers.
So in places like the City of London, we're seeing people coming back to a 3-day week. They're working Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays. Is that temporary, or do you think that's not going to be permanent and people will be in those central city areas for fewer days of the week more generally?
I think there are going to be people in for fewer days, but there are definitely businesses that need to operate for 5 days. It's a slightly weird one because there's sort of a non-logic in turning the week from a 7-day week to a 4-day at home week with 2 of them working and 3-day week. Again, it comes down to this question of society and managing. And I think at the moment, it's slightly clouded by a nervousness that exists, and it's perfectly rational to come back to a workplace. But I think also there is the ability to manage, and it still sits in this question of teamship and leadership. You know, if you are doing a project and it requires you to work as a team for 6 months intensely, where you get those really powerful moments of silence working together, and what that means in space in an office, you need to be there 5 days a week as a team, really. But right now, if you went to an investment banking company or even a lawyer and asked them their questions about that, there are definitely principals who would prefer to only come in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. The associates and the younger people perhaps are just fine to come in 5 days a week because they live in different things. So I think we've got huge society questions to do with commuting, things outside of our control, in fact. And where is that balance? So I think there, you know, because we could create unfairness or deficit in the ability to have an office in your home will become poverty. So that there's space poverty being created in the concept of not having teamship and leadership in your office. And then there's poverty actually within the activity of your own brand, your own business brand, and what rests there. So there are really deep questions for architects to ask. themselves work together with our clients and our corporate clients in understanding what are the solutions to the City of London, definitely, but all cities around the world, really.
So it's very interesting. If you look at City of London at the moment, despite people not going back into the city, there are lots of planning applications going through for major new office projects. So investors are actually looking at building offices still. What sort of projects are you working on at the moment? Are you seeing that sort of optimism amongst your clients?
We are. You have to give me slightly, because we can't declare all of them. But yes, we are also doing some large offices, certainly within the Shoreditch area. We're working with corporate clients who are certainly looking for that space again, and there's no reduction in that space. And it's fascinating. Probably the major shift in that is the necessity for amenity space. The use of AI in that space. I think buildings like 22 Bishopsgate have really advanced that thinking, that vertical connection through the building, and how that works, I think is really sort of forward thinking in terms of pandemic thinking, but also having these alternative spaces that can be used. I think there are other buildings that are very interesting. I think the question of sustainability can also be linked to the pandemic, in that actually we need to perhaps think about different methods of cooling, mixed mode cooling, openable windows, whether we're using concrete frames, how are we reusing buildings. All of those are really fascinating questions. So I don't think there's any doubt with anyone that we're going to need offices. And I think perhaps the question is, how much space do we need? But we've been here before, haven't we, Peter? We in the 1998, I remember everyone questioned whether we would actually need the amount of space we need in offices. And in fact, what happened was we needed more space. And I think actually we could be on the cusp of exactly a similar thing. I think we really pushed densities for a very long time coming up to the pandemic, to the point that actually we knew that presenteeism and absenteeism were issues. Absenteeism actually was on an increase. It was an embarrassment. Nobody wanted to admit it. And that probably, in fact, not probably, we now know it's the truth, was linked to the densities we were driving in offices, and we were just making people sicker, so they were just weren't coming to the office. That clearly is not going to be acceptable to anyone anymore, where people are much more conscious of health. So that will make a shift. Equally, I think in terms of leadership and how spaces operate, I think people have got much better at using flexible working, their laptops. So there will be a balance in that. But I think the net of that is it's not a reduction in space. And then, of course, we have growth. There are going to be more businesses. We are going to require more space. And in fact, those sectors are growing sectors, particularly in the science and tech sector, up towards Shoreditch of the city. You can see that growing. You've got Inmarsat taking a new building in the city. There's some really exciting things happening at the moment in terms of workspace and how people are thinking about that in design. So I think there's a positive future in terms of where we can go. And I think we can sometimes get obsessed with, gosh, nobody's ever going to work in an office again. Well, I doubt it's true. Everyone's happy to send their children to school and not have them, and actually really don't want them to have this type of conversation or be taught on the internet. It's a bit of a contradiction to say, well, perfectly right to do that at work, but my children can't do that at school. I mean, clearly it's not that simple, but it is a society question we need to ask about how we're operating again.
So how do these factors impact on the sort of work you're doing? How are your client briefs different to what they were before COVID?
Well, I think the question of human experience technology, that accelerated technology that's happened in the last 18 months, it has completely shifted the brief. In a way, that digital acceleration was already happening, but this really drove it. So I always think the digital conversation, maybe from the Thatcher years, when Sky came on and her grasp of how to communicate really matters. I think we're in a new digital age where everybody can now do that. It's not, you don't need Sky to be able to do it. We can do it right here now, Peter, and reach out to the world. So you know, being tech savvy, having a green room in your office where people can do it, is people are going to use podcasts. People are going to communicate rather than with written text, with verbal language, verbal podcasts and conversations like this. And we are seeing that shift in the brief. We're also seeing the brief shift very much to this question of leadership and teamship. How do we make our clay layer leadership really respond? Sometimes they're perhaps the people that are going to want to be at home, but you know, guys, you've really got to come to the office to teach the younger people. We need that collaboration to be able to do that. Does that mean you need to be there 5 days a week? Well, you know, if your people that you're trying to work with, teach even, mentor, and be kind to, need you there 5 days a week, as a leader, you've really got to consider that's the right thing to do. Certainly something we do working with our universities within our own office. And mentoring is a very important thing in all we do. It's certainly important to me. Our next generations, the people that matter. So I think we can't ignore that. And then, you know, and so those rhythms really matter. That, you know, the 5-day week rhythm as a society thing, I think we've got to be careful about thinking we can just shift it to 3 days. But I think it exists somehow. I'm not sure we know. And that's what's shifted in the briefs of the corporate clients. In the larger buildings, I think the brief has shifted, and it's about the amenity space that you can give to those corporates that attracts people back. What does the retail element look like? How do people want to reach out? I think, you know, having a doctor's clinic actually is really helpful. Why do we have to go to a GP? You know, GP is a big discussion at the moment. Why is it not in the office building? Where's the dentist? Why are these amenities not been available to us in the past? Perfectly reasonable questions. What we're readdressing is where is our village? You know, our village is at home, but it's also at the office workplace. And then you've got to travel in between those spaces sometimes. But also there may even be conversations about, you know, have we actually got the balance of the bigger city question about where we live residentially, particularly within the City of London. I think London and the UK are really quite unique globally in that you know, the diagram of how people commute actually doesn't look like the map at all. When you draw it, it's a completely different thing. So you can live in a part of Surrey, but really be really quite close to the city centre, or another part of Surrey, and you might as well be in Manchester. And that drawing that I don't think anyone's ever done actually is something that's really sort of fascinating in terms of how we'll approach commuting and thinking in the future.
Well, thank you very much, Will. I think that all this at least means lots more work for people involved in the design of office space, whether it's retrofit or dealing with the race to net zero. So, Will, thank you very much for your thoughts.
It's a very exciting time indeed. Thank you very much, Peter.